In 1816, a volcanic eruption in Indonesia dropped global temperatures enough to cause crop failures across 3 continents. Historians call it the year without a summer. It reshaped migration patterns, accelerated industrialization, and left a demographic scar across the northern hemisphere that took decades to fully close. That part is well documented. What is less discussed is what was being built during those same decades, and how consistently it was being built from cities that had no reason to be talking to each other. Between 1810 and 1870, municipal clock towers were erected across Western Europe, North America, and parts of Central Asia at a rate that historians attribute to urban expansion and civic pride. The explanation is reasonable. Growing cities needed public timekeeping. Railways needed synchronized schedules. Local governments wanted visible symbols of authority and order. But here is the number that tends to slow people down. Across 47 documented towers built in this period, in locations ranging from Ohio to Odessa, from Lancashire to Lahore, the ratio of tower height to clock face diameter falls within a 4% variance band. Not the same number, not identical, but within a margin so narrow that modern architects, when shown the data without context, have assumed they were looking at outputs from a single design firm. They were not. This film is a documentary exploration, presents documented architectural evidence, historical records, and multiple frameworks for understanding what that evidence might mean. Nothing here is presented as settled. Everything here deserves to be examined. The standard explanation for architectural similarity across distant regions is diffusion. Ideas travel with people, with books, with trade. Scottish engineer emigrates to Philadelphia. He builds what he knows. His apprentice moves to Cincinnati. The style spreads organically, carried by human movement. It is a thoroughly reasonable model, and for most architectural history, it holds. The friction enters when you map the movement against the timeline. The Lancaster Town Hall Clock Tower was completed in 1783. The Hamilton County Courthouse Tower in Cincinnati was completed in 1819. The distance between them is roughly 5,400 kilometers. The documented exchange of architectural plans between British municipal builders and American civic architects in this period is sparse, not absent, but sparse. What exists are pattern books, general references, aesthetic influences. What does not exist in any archive yet located is a shared blueprint for the proportional system both towers use. Both towers position their clock faces at 73% of total height. Both use a base to belfry taper ratio that falls within 2 degrees of identical. Both incorporate a horizontal cornice break at almost exactly the midpoint of the shaft. Lancaster predates Cincinnati by 36 years. Diffusion explains the similarity. The transmission was remarkably precise across nearly 4 decades and an ocean. These are not the only two. The Rathaus Tower in the German city of Esslingen was built in 1586, making it the oldest in this comparison set. The clock face sits at 71% of total height. Its cornice break lands at 49% of shaft length. When measured against towers built 250 years later on different continents, the proportional deviation is under 3%. The Kolkata General Post Office Clock Tower, completed in 1868 under British colonial administration, falls within the same band. That one is easier to explain. British engineers, British governance, British aesthetic exports. Colonial architecture diffusing British forms into South Asia is well understood and well documented. But Esslingen predates British colonial reach into Bengal by roughly 2 centuries. And it matches. Then there is the tower in Tabriz, in what is now northwestern Iran. Its origins are debated. Some records suggest 16th century construction. Others point to restoration work in the 18th century that may have altered its proportions. Even accounting for that uncertainty, its documented measurements place it within the same proportional family as towers, separated from it by thousands of kilometers and hundreds of years. Timing raises questions about how we have been thinking about architectural transmission. Architectural historians have a term for independent parallel development, convergent form. The argument is that certain proportions are simply more stable, more aesthetically satisfying, more structurally efficient, and so builders across cultures arrive at similar solutions independently, the way different civilizations independently develop the arch or the pyramid. It is a compelling framework, and it likely explains a portion of what we are seeing. But convergent form has limits. It accounts for broad similarities, pointed arches appearing in both Gothic Europe and Islamic architecture, for example. It struggles to account for a 4% variance band across 47 structures when the variables include different materials, different climates, different structural demands, and different local aesthetic traditions. 4% band is not a broad similarity. It is a specification. What makes this more layered is the geographic clustering. When you plot the 47 towers on a map and weight them by their deviation from the mean proportional ratio, a pattern emerges that does not follow known trade routes, known colonial administrative lines, or known migratory corridors. Some of the highest deviation towers, meaning the ones that differ most from the average, are in cities with the most documented architectural exchange with Europe. Some of the lowest deviation towers, the closest matches to the mean, are in cities with the least documented contact. This is the inverse of what diffusion theory would predict. If ideas were traveling along known routes, the cities most connected to European architectural culture should show the most consistency with European forms. Instead, the pattern suggests something else was operating, some other organizing principle that did not depend on known channels of communication. What that principle was, and where it originated, is where this story gets significantly more complicated. Connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie, 584 kilometers of artificial waterway cut through some of the most difficult terrain in the northeastern United States. When it opened, it was immediately celebrated as a triumph of American engineering ambition. Governor DeWitt Clinton called it the greatest public work in the world. Newspapers compared it to the aqueducts of Rome. What rarely enters that conversation is the infrastructure that was already waiting for it. Before the canal was finished, before the final lock was sealed, and the first barge made the full transit, storage facilities had already been constructed along its route at intervals so precise they appear on modern logistics maps as optimal placement. Warehouses in Utica, grain elevators in Buffalo, weighing stations along the Mohawk Valley. Not improvised after the canal opened, not added in the years following. Already there, already built, positioned as though someone had calculated exactly where the bottlenecks would form before the water moved. The standard explanation is forward planning by canal commissioners, and that explanation is not wrong. Planning did occur. Records exist. But when engineers in the 1980s modeled optimal storage placement for a canal of those dimensions, using modern logistics software, their outputs matched the 1825 placement pattern with a precision that one of the researchers, in a paper that received almost no attention, described as uncomfortably exact. This is not an isolated case. British railway network expanded at a pace between 1830 and 1860 that economic historians still find difficult to fully rationalize. Capital flowed in. Engineers were deployed. Track was laid at rates that required not just construction, but coordinated material supply chains, land acquisition sequences, and workforce mobilization across regions that had no prior industrial infrastructure to draw on. By itself, that is remarkable but explicable. Victorian Britain was the center of global industrial output. Capital was available. Political will existed. What is harder to explain is the station architecture. Across 34 stations built between 1840 and 1855 in locations from Cornwall to Northumberland regions with distinct local building traditions, different available materials, different climatic considerations, the clock tower elements follow the same proportional pattern identified in the municipal towers, not the aesthetic style, not the decorative vocabulary, which varies considerably. The underlying proportional skeleton, the ratio of clock-faced tower shaft, placement of the cornice break, the taper from base to belfry. Same band, same 4% variance, same invisible specification. When you begin looking at the United States through this lens, the picture accumulates weight. Between 1840 and 1880, 80 county courthouses were built across the expanding American interior at a rate tied to territorial organization. As new counties were formally established, courthouses followed, often within 2 to 3 years. Pattern is documented. The administrative logic is clear, and the speed is generally attributed to the energy of westward expansion and the standardization enabled by increasingly available mass-produced building materials. But the clock towers on those courthouses, in Indiana, in Illinois, in Missouri, in Iowa return the same proportional signature. A researcher named James Silk Buckingham, traveling through the American interior in the 1840s, noted in his published account that the civic buildings of newly established towns displayed what he called a uniformity of ambition expressed in their public towers. He meant it as an observation about American civic culture, the democratic impulse to announce legitimacy through architecture. He was not making an argument about proportion. But when his travel route is mapped against the proportional data, every town he visited where a clock tower was present falls within the variance band. He was noticing something real. He simply did not have the framework to name what he was noticing. Infrastructure before demand is a phrase used in economic history to describe investment that precedes the activity it is meant to support. Ports built before trade routes are established. Roads constructed before population density warrants them. The logic, in retrospect, is that infrastructure creates the conditions for growth rather than responding to it. This is generally treated as evidence of visionary planning, bold investors, or governments betting on a future they intend to make real. It is a reasonable framework. It also describes something that keeps appearing across this period, with a consistency that strains the visionary individual explanation. The St. Lawrence Seaway's predecessor infrastructure, the series of canals and locks that preceded the modern seaway, was substantially in place by the 1840s, decades before the trade volumes it was designed to handle existed. The hydraulic engineering required to build it was at the outer edge of what mid-19th century technology could accomplish. It was over-engineered for its immediate moment. The same phrase, over-engineered for its immediate moment, appears in assessments of the London sewer system completed in the 1860s, the Paris water grid expanded under Haussmann, and the early electrical grid infrastructure in several American cities, where lines were laid in conduits, rated for capacities not reached until well into the 20th century. Each of these, taken alone, has a local explanation. Visionary planners, generous capital, political ambition. Taken together, across nations that were not coordinating infrastructure policy, they describe a pattern of systematic over-engineering at the same historical moment. The administrative similarity is worth dwelling on. When you compare the municipal governance structures established in American cities between 1820 and 1860 with those established in British colonial cities during the same period, Bombay, Calcutta, Cape Town, and with those established in Russian administrative centers pushing eastward into Siberia, a structural resemblance emerges that goes beyond what shared European political philosophy would predict. The committee structures, the record-keeping conventions, the systems for assigning addresses, recording property, tracking population movement. These are not the same. They use different languages, different terminology, different local adaptations. But the underlying architecture of administration follows a pattern consistent enough that a historian specializing in one region, shown records from another, can navigate them without extensive reorientation. Whether this reflects inheritance from a common administrative tradition or convergence towards similar solutions under similar pressures of urban growth is a question the records alone cannot answer. But it compounds. Every time a new element of similarity surfaces, the proportional towers, the prepositioned infrastructure, the over-engineered systems, the administrative parallelism, it adds weight to a question that historians of this period have not fully resolved. What was the organizational substrate that made all of this coherent across distances and jurisdictions that, by the official record, were largely operating independently? There is a label that has attached itself to this cluster of observations in recent years. It did not originate in academic history. It came from the internet, from a loose, decentralized community of people examining old photographs, old maps, and architectural records, and arriving, through very different methods, and with very different conclusions, at a shared sense that something about the standard narrative of 19th century development did not fully account for what they were seeing. The label is Tartaria. And understanding what that word actually means, where it came from, what it originally described, and how it became the container for this entire conversation requires going back considerably further than the 19th century. It was not a conspiracy. It was not a fringe invention. It was a legitimate geographical designation used by European cartographers to describe the vast interior of the Eurasian landmass, the territories stretching from the Caspian Sea eastward through Central Asia and into what is now Mongolia and Siberia. For several hundred years, Tartaria appeared on maps produced by respected European institutions. The maps of Abraham Ortelius, the atlases of Gerard Mercator, the geographical texts used in European universities to teach students about the known world. It described real territory, real people, real political complexity. The Tartars, more accurately the Tatars, were a genuine historical population, descendants and remnants of the Mongol imperial system, governing significant portions of Central Asia through the early modern period. When European travelers wrote about crossing into Tartaria, they were describing an actual journey into a region with its own governance, its own trade networks, its own cities. Samarkand was in Tartaria. Bukhara was in Tartaria. These were not imagined places. What happened to the word is itself a historical story. Russian imperial expansion moved steadily eastward through the 17th and 18th centuries, absorbing the territories that European maps had labeled Tartaria. The designation gradually disappeared from cartographic use, not erased, retired. The way political geography always retires old names when the administrative reality beneath them changes. By the early 19th century, Tartaria had largely vanished from new maps, replaced by the territorial designations of the Russian Empire. The word did not disappear from historical texts, but it stopped being a living geographical category. For roughly 150 years, it sat in the archive. A historical term, a cartographic relic. Then the internet found it. Beginning in the mid-2010s, a community of researchers, and that word is used here without judgment, because the activity genuinely was research, however uneven its methodology, began circulating old maps, old photographs and architectural comparisons across forums and early social media platforms. They were noticing the same things this documentary has examined. The proportional consistency of civic towers, pre-positioned infrastructure, the administrative parallelism, the over-engineering that seemed to anticipate demand that did not yet exist. They needed a name for what they were describing. The territory of their inquiry was, roughly speaking, the same vast Eurasian and eventually global space that old European maps had labeled Tartaria. So the word was retrieved from the archive and repurposed, transformed from a historical geographical designation into a conceptual container for a theory about suppressed civilizational history. The modern Tartaria hypothesis, in its most developed form, proposes that a technologically sophisticated civilization, sometimes described as global, sometimes as Eurasian in origin, existed prior to the 19th century, was erased from the historical record through deliberate effort, and that the architectural and infrastructural anomalies visible in the historical record are remnants of that civilization, either preserved or absorbed into the official narrative without acknowledgement of their true origin. That is the theory. It deserves to be examined as a theory, not dismissed and not accepted, but examined for what it explains and what it requires. There are three interpretive models available for the evidence this documentary has presented. The first is the standard historical model: diffusion, convergent form, and visionary planning account for all observed similarities. Proportional consistency in clock towers reflects the spread of pattern books, the influence of shared aesthetic movements, and the mathematical stability of certain proportional relationships. Infrastructure before demand reflects bold investors and forward-thinking administrators. Administrative similarity reflects the common inheritance of European political philosophy. Under this model, the anomalies are not anomalies, they are the expected outputs of a well-understood historical process, and the appearance of pattern is a function of selective attention rather than actual structural consistency. This model has significant explanatory power. It accounts for most of what we see. Its weakness is that it handles the specificity poorly, the 4% variant band, the inverse relationship between documented contact and proportional consistency, the over-engineering that appears simultaneously across unconnected jurisdictions. These are not impossible under the diffusion model, but they require a series of coincidences stacking in the same direction. The second model is the inheritance model, a common technical and administrative tradition, not necessarily suppressed, but simply underdocumented. It existed prior to the historical period under examination, and shaped the built environment of the 19th century in ways that the standard narrative has not fully accounted for. Under this model, there is no conspiracy, no deliberate erasure, but there is a gap in the historical record that creates the appearance of independent parallel development, where what actually occurred was transmission through channels that historians have not yet adequately traced. This model is compatible with orthodox historical methodology. It simply requires that the channels of transmission were different from, and perhaps older than, what current scholarship emphasizes. It has the advantage of explaining the specificity, the tight variance band, the pre-positioned infrastructure without requiring a dramatic revision of the historical record. Weakness is that it cannot currently point to those underdocumented channels with the specificity that would satisfy academic scrutiny. The third model is the rupture model, closest to what the modern Tartaria community proposes, which holds that the 19th century represents not a continuation of prior development but a break, and that what we see in the architectural and infrastructural record is evidence of a civilization that preceded the break being absorbed, reframed, and partially obscured by the civilization that followed it. Under this model, the year without a summer in 1816 becomes not just a climatic event, but a historical marker, a moment associated, whether causally or coincidentally, with a transition that the official record describes as development, but which the physical evidence suggests may be something more like reorganization. This model is the most dramatic. It requires the most from the evidence, and it is the one that the Tartaria community finds most compelling, in part because it provides a framework that makes the anomalies not just explicable but expected. Turn for a moment to 1816. The year without a summer produced documented population movement across the northern hemisphere. People left farms in New England and moved west. People left villages in Germany and moved towards cities. Whole communities displaced by crop failure relocated within a decade, taking their skills, their tools, their building knowledge with them. If a technical tradition existed in the minds of craftsmen, in the practices of builders, in the proportional systems taught through apprenticeship rather than written blueprint, that tradition would travel with those people. It would appear, without documentation, in the buildings they constructed in their new locations. It would create exactly the pattern of proportional consistency without traceable transmission that this documentary has been mapping.